My parents are real. They have over 400 people, and so asterisk D over 500. When the detective and I got to their basement, there were many human hanging on. Hey Reddit, I'm not even sure how to start this, but I need to get this off my chest. This is a long story, but I'm going to tell you everything because I've never been able to speak about it. Not fully. Even now, I feel like my hands are shaking just typing this. If I don't get this out, I'm going to lose it. So, here goes. I guess I'll start with my family. Growing up, things weren't exactly normal, though I didn't really understand how bad it was until much later. I'm from a small town where everyone knew everyone, but it didn't stop me from feeling isolated. You'd think having neighbors so close would give you a sense of safety, but that wasn't the case for me. My parents were, well, they were a lot. I've seen other people talk about tough childhoods, but mine was a level of messed up that I don't think many people experience. My dad, Jim, was the sort of man who dominated every room he entered, not because he was loud or physically imposing, but because of this quiet, seething rage that followed him everywhere. He didn't have to say much to get his point across. One look, one small sigh of disappointment, and you knew you'd screwed up. Then there was my mom. My mom was the silent type too, but not in the same way. She was more like a shadow behind my dad. She never really fought back, never defended me when things got bad. Sometimes, I'd catch her watching from the kitchen as my dad would tear into me for some small, insignificant mistake, her face blank like she'd shut off. Other times, it seemed like she actively encouraged it. There were moments when her lips would curl up in this small, satisfied smirk, as if seeing me break down under his words was some twisted source of joy for her. From a young age, I was convinced it was my fault. I thought if I was just better, if I didn't mess up, maybe things would change. Maybe Dad wouldn't yell, and maybe Mom would finally step in and stop him. But it never worked. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't do anything right. School was my only escape, but even that wasn't much of a refuge. I wasn't exactly popular. Kids didn't want to be around me. I think they could sense something was wrong, something off about me, even if I couldn't articulate it at the time. I wasn't good at making friends, not when I was always on edge, worried about what was going to happen at home once school let out. My teachers noticed that I was different too. I remember one of them, Mrs. Daniels, once asked me if everything was okay at home. I just nodded, said everything was fine. What else could I say? I was terrified of what would happen if my dad found out I was talking to people about our family business. And trust me, he would have found out. He always found out. He had this way of knowing things I didn't even know I had done wrong. Still, the abuse at home wasn't what kept me up at night. That was bad, don't get me wrong, but there was something darker, something I could never quite figure out. It started when I was around 7 or 8. We had this string of neighbors, families, young couples, who would move into the house next door and stay for a few months before they just vanished. No for sale signs, no moving trucks. One day they'd be there, and the next gone. I used to think maybe it was just how things worked. People moved away, right? But even in my small town, people didn't just vanish like that. The weird thing was, every time one of them disappeared, my dad would always come back from work with a huge amount of meat. We didn't exactly have money, but suddenly there'd be these massive cuts of beef in our fridge, stacks of steaks, roasts, and ribs. And whenever I asked where it came from, my dad would give the same answer every time. I bought it in bulk, he'd say, barely looking at me. Discount at the butcher's. It didn't make sense to me then. None of it did. But I was just a kid. I didn't ask too many questions because that would lead to a blow-up, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with his temper. So I let it go. Even though part of me couldn't stop thinking about the weird connection between the new neighbors disappearing and all that meat in the freezer. As I got older, the abuse only escalated. By the time I was 13, my dad's temper had reached new levels. He wasn't just yelling anymore. He started throwing things, plates, tools, whatever he could grab, and they'd crash against the walls, inches from my face. I always knew I had to duck just in time, or I'd end up hurt. Mom never said a word. She just sat there, her eyes glazed over, pretending not to notice. There was one time when things got really bad. I think I was 14 at the time. I had just gotten back from school, my bag still slung over my shoulder, when I noticed something was off. My dad was standing in the kitchen, and there was this weird smell in the air. It was almost like metal, but sharper, thicker. He turned to me with this dead-eyed look and muttered something about a messy job. I didn't ask what he meant, just like I didn't ask about the bloody rag he was wiping his hands on. That night, I couldn't sleep. My room was next to the garage, and I heard him out there, moving things around. Heavy thuds, the sound of scraping. I lay there for hours wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, listening to those noises. In the morning, there was more meat in the fridge, enough to last us months. I went to school the next day like nothing had happened, like my life wasn't unraveling. It was what I had learned to do, keep my head down and push through it. I didn't talk to anyone about it. Who could I talk to? I had no friends, no one to confide in. I felt trapped in my own life, a prisoner in my own house, with nowhere to turn. The next few months blurred together. The neighbors next door had vanished again, and we had more meat than ever in the house. There were nights when I'd hear strange noises coming from the basement, and I'd shut my eyes tight, pretending it was just the house settling. But deep down, I knew better. I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Then, something happened that I'll never forget. It was a Saturday, and I had come back from riding my bike around the neighborhood. Anything to stay out of the house. When I walked in, my dad was standing in the kitchen, but this time, he wasn't alone. One of our neighbors, a guy named Mr. Simmons, was with him. He had moved in next door just a few weeks ago, and he seemed nice enough. He always waved at me when I rode by, and once, he even gave me some candy when I helped him carry groceries. But now, something about the way he was standing made me uneasy. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling. My dad was standing next to him, his face as hard and cold as ever. "Go to your room," Dad said to me, his voice low, almost casual. But there was something in his tone that made me freeze. I couldn't move. I watched as Dad reached into a drawer and pulled out something long and silver. I don't know why, but in that moment, I knew I had to leave. I had to get out of there. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I couldn't tear my eyes away from what was happening in front of me. Then, without warning, my dad grabbed Mr. Simmons by the arm and dragged him toward the basement door. Mr. Simmons didn't scream. He didn't fight back. It was like he knew it was useless. I wanted to help him, wanted to shout, but my throat felt like it was closing up. I just stood there, watching in stunned silence as my dad shoved him down the stairs and disappeared after him. That night, I heard the noises again. The same scraping, the same heavy thuds. But this time, they were louder, more urgent. I spent the whole night curled up in bed, trembling, waiting for it to stop. The next morning, when I went downstairs, the basement door was open, and the smell was unbearable. My dad was already in the kitchen, drinking his coffee like nothing had happened. I didn't ask. I knew better than to ask. Instead, I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door. Just as I was about to leave, Dad stopped me. "I got more meat," he said, his voice flat. "There's enough to last us the whole winter." I left without saying a word, my stomach churning. I didn't want to think about it, about what he meant, but I couldn't stop the images from flooding my mind. The neighbors who disappeared, the meat in the freezer, the sounds from the basement. It all clicked, and I felt sick. After that day, things started spiraling even more. I couldn't look at my dad without feeling nauseous. I couldn't eat anything from the freezer. The thought of it made me gag. I spent more and more time away from home, riding my bike for hours, wandering through the town, trying to escape the growing fear that gnawed at me. But I couldn't run from it forever. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning of the nightmare. And the worst was yet to come. I don't know what finally broke inside me, but one day I decided enough was enough. I couldn't take the nightmares, the constant fear, and the weight of what I knew was happening in that house. My father wasn't just a monster to me anymore. He was something darker, something I could never fully understand. It wasn't just the beatings, the constant psychological torment. It was the disappearances, the meat in the freezer, the lies I had been forced to swallow for years. I was terrified, but I had to get out. I had to try. I don't know what I thought would happen when I walked into the police station that day. I was 16, scared out of my mind, and hadn't even planned what I would say. My clothes were wrinkled, my face pale. The woman at the front desk gave me a look, half pity, half suspicion, as I approached, but I just blurted it all out. "I need help," I said, my voice trembling. "My dad. He's done something terrible." Her eyes narrowed, and she asked me to sit down while she called someone over. I waited in a small room, staring at the walls, my mind racing. For a brief moment, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe someone would finally listen. Maybe they'd stop him, and I'd be free. But nothing's ever that simple. As I sat there waiting, I had no idea that my father was already on to me. Somehow, he had overheard me. I don't know if he had followed me to the station, or if he had always been watching, always listening. But by the time the police took me seriously enough to visit my house, he had already cleaned up everything. When we got to the house, my heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. The officers knocked on the door, and my dad answered with that same calm, cold expression he always wore. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. He invited them in, even offered them coffee. I watched, helpless, as they searched the house. Every room, every corner. The basement. But there was nothing. No blood. No bodies. No neighbors hidden under the floorboards. And the meat? All gone. The freezer was spotless. The police asked my dad a few questions, but he was prepared for them. He had an answer for everything, a fake smile on his face as he spun his lies. "I don't know why my son would say something like that," he told them, his voice dripping with concern. "He's been acting strange for a while now. Maybe some trouble at school?" I felt my heart sink as I realized what was happening. He had set me up. He was making me look like the problem. The officers exchanged glances, and one of them pulled me aside. "Listen," she said gently, "are you sure you're okay? Is there something else going on? It's okay to tell us if you're in trouble." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her and beg her to see through his lies, to search harder, to dig deeper. But instead, I just nodded and said nothing. I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe me. After the police left, my father didn't say a word. He just looked at me, that dead-eyed stare drilling into me, and I knew what was coming. That night, he didn't even bother to hide it. He beat me worse than ever, throwing me against the walls, smashing his fists into my ribs until I could barely breathe. "You thought you could get away?" he growled. "You thought anyone would believe you?" The next morning, I packed a small bag with what little I had and made the decision. I wasn't going to stay there another day. I didn't care if I had nowhere to go. I didn't care if I'd end up homeless. I wasn't staying in that house, waiting for whatever horrible fate he had planned for me. I waited until my parents left for the day. My mom had a shift at the local grocery store, and my dad had gone out for business, whatever that meant. As soon as they were gone, I ran. I didn't take much, just some clothes and a little bit of cash I had saved over the years. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get me out of that nightmare. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far away as possible. I started walking down the highway, my thumb out, hoping someone would stop. A few cars passed, and I started to lose hope. But after about an hour, an old beat-up truck pulled over, and the driver, a middle-aged guy with a graying beard, waved me in. "Where you headed?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. "Anywhere but here," I muttered, and that seemed to be good enough for him. He drove me to the next city, about an hour away, and dropped me off at a diner near the bus station. "Good luck, kid," he said before driving off. I stood there for a minute, staring at the unfamiliar streets, feeling completely lost but also free. It was the first time in my life I felt like I had some control, even if I didn't know what to do with it. Over the next few days, I slept wherever I could. Under bridges, in abandoned buildings, anywhere that would keep me out of the cold. I eventually found a few odd jobs, washing cars, handing out flyers, anything to make enough money to eat. It wasn't much, but it kept me going. One day, while I was washing cars in a parking lot, a man approached me. He was older, probably in his 50s, and dressed in a nice suit. At first, I thought he was going to tell me to leave, that I was loitering. But instead, he introduced himself. "You're working hard," he said, his voice kind but firm. "What's your name?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's Jacob." The man smiled. "I'm Judge Harold Mercer. You ever think about doing something more with your life?" Jacob? I didn't know what to say. Who was this guy? And why was he talking to me like that? But something about him felt safe. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to keep my guard up. We talked for a while, and I ended up telling him a little bit about my situation. Not everything, just that I had run away from home and was trying to make it on my own. He listened, really listened, and then he did something I never expected. How about you come stay with me for a while? He offered. I've got a big house, plenty of room. You could get cleaned up, maybe go back to school. What do you think? I didn't trust people easily, but there was something different about him. He wasn't trying to manipulate me, wasn't trying to take advantage. He was offering me a chance. And at that moment, I realized how badly I needed one. I agreed, and he took me in. His house was massive, way bigger than anything I had ever seen. It was the kind of place you only see in movies. Tall ceilings, expensive furniture, the whole 9 yards. For the first time in my life, I had my own room, a place where I could sleep without listening for footsteps outside my door, without the constant fear of what might happen in the middle of the night. Over the next few weeks, I started to open up to him. I told him about my father, about the things I had seen, the disappearances, the meat. He listened, but I could tell he didn't fully believe me. He chuckled once and said, "Jacob, you've got quite an imagination, but you're safe now. That's all that matters." It hurt a little, knowing that he thought I was making it all up, but I didn't push it. Maybe it was easier for him to believe that I was exaggerating, that the horrors I had experienced weren't real. But they were real to me, and they haunted me every day. Despite that, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Judge Mercer encouraged me to go back to school, and with his help, I enrolled in a local community college. I started studying law, mostly because I admired him and wanted to understand how the system worked, how people like my father could get away with the things they did. Life with the judge was strange at first. I wasn't used to someone being kind to me without expecting something in return. He wasn't perfect. He had his moments where he was distant, caught up in his work, but he was more of a father to me than my real dad ever was. He gave me advice, supported me, and pushed me to do better. It was like I had stepped into a completely different world. As I got older, I started to make friends at school. Real friends, for the first time in my life. There was Sarah, a brilliant girl who was studying to become a prosecutor. She was sharp, quick-witted, and had this infectious laugh that could light up a room. Then there was Marcus, a guy who had grown up rough like me but had managed to turn his life around. We'd sit in the library for hours, talking about everything from cases we were studying to the messed up stuff we had both been through. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone. I had people I could trust, people who actually cared about me. But no matter how far I tried to run from my past, it always lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that one day, my father would find me. That one day, the truth would come out, and everything I had built would come crashing down. One night, as I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I couldn't keep running forever. If I was ever going to be free, really free, I had to confront what had happened. I had to confront my father. The next morning, I told Judge Mercer everything. Not just the surface-level stuff, but the real horrors, the blood, the neighbors who disappeared, the meat. I expected him to laugh it off again, to tell me I was overreacting. But this time, he didn't. He sat there, silent, his face pale, as I laid it all out. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Fear. I was 20 when I finally decided it was time. I had spent years trying to move on, to distance myself from the horrors of my past. But no matter how far I ran, the memories clung to me. They haunted my dreams, seeping into every quiet moment. There was no escaping them. So, instead of running, I decided to confront them. By this time, I had finished my degree in law, thanks to Judge Mercer. I had a promising future ahead of me, but all I could think about was my father, what he had done, and what he might still be doing. For years, I had suspected the truth, but I had never been able to prove it. The police hadn't believed me back then, and I knew they wouldn't believe me now without evidence. I needed hard proof. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. His name was Blake Morrow, and he was everything you'd expect from a private detective: a grizzled, chain-smoking guy in his late 40s, with a weathered trench coat and a permanent scowl etched onto his face. He had seen it all, or so he claimed. When I told him my story, he raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss me. He'd heard stranger things, he said, and if what I told him was true, he'd find out. We began our investigation cautiously. I hadn't been back to my hometown in years, and going back now felt like stepping into enemy territory. Blake and I drove through the familiar streets, past the houses I had known as a kid, past the places where I used to ride my bike, and finally to the house. The house where it had all started. It looked the same as ever, ordinary, suburban, with nothing to give away the horrors that lay inside. Blake set up surveillance first. He spent weeks watching my father from a distance, taking notes, capturing photos. He saw the usual. My father going to work, my mother going about her daily routine. But then, one evening, something changed. Blake called me, his voice urgent. "Your old man's up to something." I saw him bring a neighbor inside the house. A guy about your dad's age. He didn't come out. That was it. I knew we had to move fast. If my father was doing what I suspected, that neighbor didn't have much time. We decided to break into the house when both my parents were out. My dad worked long shifts at a nearby factory, and my mom had a part-time job at the grocery store. Blake had scouted out their schedules, and we knew exactly when the house would be empty. We parked down the street, out of sight. Blake handed me a small handheld camera. "You record everything," he said. "We're not leaving here without solid evidence." My heart was racing as we approached the house. The memories of what had happened here, of what I had lived through, came rushing back. I was trembling, but I pushed it down. This was my chance to stop him, my chance to put an end to all of it. We slipped inside through the back door, which Blake had already unlocked earlier. The house was eerily quiet, just as I remembered it. The same old furniture, the same musty smell. It was like walking into a time capsule, a place frozen in time. Blake motioned for me to follow him as we made our way to the basement door. That's where it had to be. Whatever my father was hiding, it had to be down there. We opened the door, and a cold draft hit us, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell. I recognized that smell immediately, blood. The stairs creaked under our feet as we descended into the darkness. The basement was cluttered with old boxes, tools, and random junk my dad had collected over the years. But something was off. Behind a pile of boxes, Blake spotted a small, hidden door, one I had never seen before. It was old and rusted, blending in with the rest of the basement. Without a word, Blake pulled out a crowbar and began prying it open. It took a few minutes, but the door finally gave way with a groan. What we saw on the other side froze me in place. The room was enormous, far bigger than I had ever imagined the basement to be. But it wasn't the size that shocked me, it was what was inside. The first thing I noticed was the hooks. Dozens of them, hanging from the ceiling, each one holding the lifeless body of a human being. Their skin was pale, drained of blood, and their flesh had been carved in a way that made them look like cattle at a slaughterhouse. The stench of death and decay was overwhelming, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. In the center of the room was a massive meat grinder. It looked old, rusted, and industrial, the kind of thing you'd see in a factory. It was big enough to fit a grown man, and sitting inside it, bound and gagged, was the neighbor Blake had seen my father bring into the house. His eyes were wide with terror, his muffled screams filling the room as he saw us. Blake immediately started recording everything, his camera panning over the bodies, the organs in jars lined up on shelves, and finally, the neighbor in the grinder. My mind was reeling. I had suspected something like this, but seeing it in person, seeing the horror of what my father had been doing, it was more than I could handle. "We have to get him out," I said, my voice shaking. Blake nodded, handing me the camera as he moved toward the grinder. As I approached, I couldn't help but notice the control panel on the side of the machine. It looked ancient, with buttons and levers that were covered in grime. One of the levers caught my eye, a rusted switch that controlled the machine. My hands were trembling, and as I reached out to steady myself, I accidentally brushed against the lever. The sound that followed was deafening. The machine roared to life, its old motor groaning as the gears began to turn. The neighbor's muffled screams grew louder as the grinder's blades slowly started moving beneath him. I froze, panic surging through me. "Turn it off. Turn it off." I screamed at Blake, dropping the camera as I rushed toward the grinder. The blades were old, rusted, and slow to heat up, but they were starting to move. Blake fumbled with the controls, his hands shaking as he tried to find the right switch. The neighbor's eyes were wild with fear, and I could see the terror in his face as the blades crept closer to his legs. Without thinking, I spotted the power cord running from the machine and lunged for it. I yanked it from the socket, and the grinder sputtered before finally coming to a stop. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound of the machine. We both rushed to the neighbor, who was still bound in the grinder, his legs scratched and bleeding but miraculously intact. The machine had barely warmed up before we managed to stop it, but his legs had been scraped by the blades, leaving deep gashes that oozed blood. Blake and I worked quickly, untying him and pulling him free from the grinder. His legs were trembling, and he collapsed into our arms as we dragged him away from the machine. "We need to get out of here," Blake said, his voice tight. "Now." I grabbed the camera from the floor, making sure we had the footage. We half-carried, half-dragged the neighbor up the stairs, my heart racing the entire time. I kept expecting my father to walk through the door, to catch us, to end everything right there. But the house remained silent. We made it to Blake's car and shoved the neighbor into the back seat. Blake jumped into the driver's seat, and I barely had time to close the door before he slammed on the gas, speeding away from the house that had haunted me for so long. As we drove, I looked back at the house through the rearview mirror, a sick feeling settling in my stomach. The nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. The basement. I could still see it in my mind. The meat grinder, the bodies hanging on hooks, the jars filled with organs. It was worse than anything I had ever imagined. My father was a monster, and now I had the proof. But I knew this wasn't the end. There was still so much to do. We had saved the neighbor, but what about the others? What about the people who had already been butchered? How many more victims were there? And how long had this been going on? I looked over at Blake, who was focused on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The footage on the camera would be enough to put my father away for life. But I knew it wouldn't be that easy. My father was smart, and he had connections in town. He would do whatever it took to cover his tracks, to make sure no one believed us. But for the first time in years, I wasn't scared. I was angry. Angry at what he had done to those people, what he had done to me. I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I was a lawyer, and I was going to make sure he paid for every life he had taken. We drove in silence for a long time before Blake finally spoke. "You did good in there, kid," he said, his voice low. "You kept your head when it counted." I didn't respond. My mind was still racing, going over everything we had seen, everything we had done. It didn't feel real, sitting in the passenger seat of Blake's car, the camera with the horrifying footage clutched tightly in my hands. The car rumbled along the highway toward the courthouse, the silence between us thick with tension. We both knew what this video meant and what was coming. My father was about to be exposed for the monster he truly was, and this time, no amount of lies or manipulation would save him. But it wasn't going to be easy. My father wasn't just any criminal. He had covered his tracks for years, and he was clever. More clever than I had given him credit for. The bodies we had seen in the basement, the meat grinder, the organs stored like trophies. He had been doing this for longer than anyone could have guessed. And now, with the video evidence in our hands, it was time to put an end to it. Blake parked outside the courthouse, the imposing building casting long shadows in the fading afternoon light. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the images from that basement, the blood, the bodies hanging on hooks, the sound of the grinder roaring to life. But I had to push it down. I had to focus. "We ready?" Blake asked, lighting another cigarette, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the courthouse steps. "Yeah," I muttered, though I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. Together, we walked inside, the cold marble halls echoing with the sounds of our footsteps. I felt like everyone was watching us, though it was probably just my nerves. We headed straight for the office of the district attorney, a woman named Amanda Garrett, who Blake had worked with on a few other cases. She had agreed to meet with us after Blake gave her a vague outline of what we had uncovered, but even she didn't know the full extent of what we were about to show her. Garrett was sitting at her desk when we entered, her expression skeptical as she gestured for us to sit down. "So, what exactly do you have for me?" she asked, her tone impatient. Blake didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled the camera from my hands and placed it on her desk. "This is what we have. I'll let you see for yourself." Garrett raised an eyebrow but nodded, pulling the camera toward her and playing the video. For the next few minutes, the room was filled with the sound of the horrific footage. Blake's shaky recording of the basement, the bodies hanging on hooks, and the muffled screams of the neighbor in the grinder. Garrett's face turned pale as she watched, her hand going to her mouth in shock. When the video ended, she sat in silence for a moment, staring at the screen as if she couldn't believe what she had just seen. This is real," she finally asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. "It's real. That's my father's basement. That's what he's been doing for years." Garrett took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair as she processed everything. "We need to act fast. If this gets out, your father will run, and we'll never find him." It wasn't long before a warrant was issued for my father's arrest, and the police descended on our old house. But my father was ready. By the time they got there, the basement had been cleared out. The bodies were gone, the meat grinder had disappeared, and every trace of evidence had been meticulously erased. My father had been one step ahead of us, and for the moment, it seemed like he might get away with it. My father, of course, protested his innocence, claiming the video was fake and that he had no idea what I was talking about. He spun his lies with the same ease he always had, and for a moment, I could see the police hesitating, wondering if they had made a mistake. But I wasn't going to let him get away this time. The trial started a few weeks later. It felt surreal, sitting in the courtroom across from my father, the man who had haunted my life for so long. He looked calm, composed, like nothing was out of the ordinary. He had hired a high-powered attorney, a man named Gregory Whitman, who had a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. Whitman wasted no time attacking the credibility of the case, arguing that the video was doctored, that there was no physical evidence, and that my father was the victim of a vengeful son. On the other side, Amanda Garrett did her best to build the case. But without the physical evidence from the basement, it was tough. She relied heavily on the testimony of the neighbor we had saved, but Whitman tore into him during cross-examination, painting him as unreliable and mentally unstable. The trial dragged on for days, and the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. My father sat there with that smug look on his face, knowing that without the physical evidence, it would be his word against ours. He was confident, too confident, and I was getting desperate. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal day in court where Whitman had practically ripped apart our entire case, I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Blake. My head was in my hands, frustration boiling up inside me. We had the truth, but it didn't matter. The system was working against us, and my father was about to walk free. Blake was pacing, smoking his cigarette down to a stub, looking just as agitated as I felt. "We need something stronger. We need more than testimony. You have to consider it," he said, not meeting my gaze. I knew what he meant. The video, the one we hadn't shown in court yet, the one that showed the full horror of what was in that basement. We had held it back, worried that it would be too much, too inflammatory. But now, it was our only option. "I'm showing the video," I said, my voice resolute. Blake stopped pacing, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and relief. About time. The next day, we entered the courtroom, and I could feel the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. I knew that showing the video would change everything. It wasn't just about proving my father's guilt anymore. It was about exposing the full extent of his crimes. When it was my turn to take the stand, I glanced over at my father. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something there, a flicker of fear. He knew what was coming. "I'd like to submit new evidence," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. I handed the camera over to Garrett, who plugged it into the court system. The video played on the screen, and the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The footage of the basement, the hanging bodies, the jars of organs, the neighbor in the grinder. It was all there, in gruesome detail. The room was filled with gasps, people turning away in horror, but I couldn't look away. When the video ended, the judge, my adoptive father, sat in silence, his face pale. He didn't say a word for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a low voice, he called for a recess. The court needed time to process what they had just seen. The trial didn't last much longer after that. My father's attorney tried to argue that the video was fake, that it had been doctored, but no one believed him anymore. The footage was too damning, too real. My father's composure crumbled in those final days, and his lies began to unravel. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a guilty verdict. My father and my mother were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They were taken away in handcuffs, their faces expressionless, as the courtroom erupted in murmurs of shock and disgust. The police reopened investigations into the disappearances of the neighbors, and when they searched the house again, they found what we had missed: hidden compartments in the basement filled with more bodies, more evidence of the grisly business my father had been running for years. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was emptiness. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on with my life. The police gave me a commendation for helping bring my father to justice and a reward for assisting with the investigation. I used the money to buy myself a small house, a place where I could finally start fresh. I even donated a large portion of it to the families of my father's victims, hoping that in some small way, it might help them heal. But something still wasn't right. No matter how much I tried to move forward, the darkness of my past still clung to me. Then, one morning, a package arrived at my new house. It was a small box, plain and unmarked, with no return address. At first, I thought it might be a gift from a friend or a delivery mix-up. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a human heart, still warm, wrapped in plastic. My hands shook as I stared at it, bile rising in my throat. Beneath the heart was a small, blood-stained note. It was short, just a few words scrawled in messy handwriting. "You can't escape. We're always watching." I dropped the note, my mind spinning, panic clawing at my chest. Who had sent this? How had they found me? Had my father been working with someone else? Or was this someone new? I stumbled backward, the walls of my house closing in around me. When I saw the heart in the box, my first instinct was to burn everything, to throw it into the fire and pretend it didn't exist. But I couldn't. I had to be smarter than that. Someone had found me, and they were sending a message. I knew better than to ignore it. With shaking hands, I wrapped the heart back up and placed it carefully in the box. I wasn't sure how, but whoever had sent it had made sure I understood exactly what it was. This wasn't just a sick prank. This was a threat. A promise that what I thought was over was only beginning. I took the box and the note straight to the police station, my heart pounding in my chest the entire way. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. Every figure on the street was a potential enemy. I felt exposed, like a target had been painted on my back, and for all I knew, it had. When I walked into the station, Blake was there, sitting in a corner, going over paperwork from another case. His eyes widened when he saw the look on my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, standing up. "I think I have," I muttered, placing the box on the front desk. "You need to see this." Blake's expression darkened when he opened the box, and he didn't need to ask any questions. He called over a couple of detectives, and soon I was sitting in a small interrogation room while they examined the contents of the package. The note, stained with blood, was bagged and tagged as evidence. The heart was taken to the forensics lab for analysis. "Whoever sent this knows about you," Blake said after a while, sitting down across from me. "This isn't random." I nodded. "They're trying to send a message. They want me to know they're still out there." For the next few days, the investigation kicked into high gear. The police started working on tracking down who could have sent the heart, combing through databases of known criminals, suppliers, and anyone who might have had a connection to my father. They even brought in a few forensic experts to analyze the heart itself, how fresh it was, who it belonged to. Every angle was being investigated. But the deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. Through a combination of DNA analysis and deep criminal investigations, they uncovered a hidden network of suppliers and buyers, people involved in the illegal trade of human meat. My father hadn't just been working alone. He had been part of something much bigger, a grotesque black market that spanned multiple cities and possibly countries. But there was one glaring issue. They didn't know who the key players were. The people running the show were still faceless, hidden in the shadows. However, it became clear that these weren't just a few crazed individuals. This was an organized network of suppliers, buyers, and traffickers who traded in human lives for profit. My father had been one of their main suppliers, and now that he was gone, they saw me as a threat to their operation. They were coming for me, and they had already started. The police took the threat seriously. They assigned a couple of armed officers to follow me everywhere I went, their presence both reassuring and suffocating. I couldn't leave my house without seeing their unmarked car parked across the street, their eyes tracking every move I made. I wasn't free, not really, but at least I was safe, or so I thought. A week passed, and despite the investigation ramping up, the police still hadn't made any arrests. They were gathering pieces of the puzzle, but the full picture remained elusive. I tried to go about my life, but the constant presence of danger made it impossible. I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside my window sent my heart racing. Then, one night, everything fell apart. It started like any other evening. I was restless, pacing in my living room while the officers sat in their car outside. I hadn't left the house all day, and the tension in the air was thick, as if something terrible was about to happen. I was about to go to bed when I heard a knock on the door. It was strange. No one ever knocked. The officers had a key to the house if they needed to come in, and no one else should have been there. My heart skipped a beat as I approached the door, my mind racing. Maybe it was just a delivery, a neighbor, something innocent. But when I opened the door, 3 figures stood in the shadows. At first, I couldn't make out their faces, but as they stepped forward, the dim light from the hallway revealed the grotesque reality. They were wearing the faces of their victims, human skin, crudely stitched together, hanging over their heads like masks. The smell hit me next, the stench of rot and decay clinging to them like a second skin. Before I could react, they lunged at me, grabbing me by the arms and dragging me outside. My screams were muffled by the thick hand that clamped over my mouth. The officers in the car didn't even have time to react as I was hauled down the street and into the shadows beneath the overpass. They had chosen the perfect spot, dark, secluded, far enough from prying eyes that no one would hear what was about to happen. They shoved me against a concrete pillar, and one of them pulled out a machete, its blade glinting in the faint light. "Since you took our supply," one of them growled, his voice thick with malice, "you'll replace it." I was surrounded. Their grotesque masks, stitched together from the faces of their victims, made them look like something out of a nightmare. The machete swung through the air, inches from my face, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. My mind was racing, trying to find a way out, but there was none. "We're going to cut you up nice and slow," another one hissed. "Sell your pieces, just like your daddy did." I could hear the officers shouting in the distance, the sound of footsteps approaching, but it felt like they were miles away. Time slowed to a crawl as one of the attackers raised the machete high, aiming for my head. The first shot rang out, echoing through the empty streets. One of the attackers collapsed, clutching his knee as blood poured from the wound. The others hesitated for a moment, but it was enough. The police officers, guns drawn, stormed the scene, firing at the attackers with precision. Another shot rang out, and a second attacker went down, his shoulder blown apart by the bullet. The third one dropped his machete and raised his hands, his grotesque mask slipping off as he fell to his knees, trembling in fear. It was over in seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. The police surrounded me, checking for injuries, but I barely registered what was happening. All I could see were the faces of those men, the masks they wore, the sickening realization of what they had planned to do to me. In the aftermath, the police interrogated the men, and the truth of the operation began to unravel. They were buyers, regular customers who had been purchasing human flesh from my father and others like him for years. Their network was vast, and according to the data they uncovered, over 500 people had been killed, with more than 400 of those bodies consumed. The parts they hadn't eaten had been sold off to other buyers, or discarded like trash. The men I had encountered were just a small part of a much larger web, and the police were determined to bring the entire operation down. It was going to take months, maybe even years, to uncover everyone involved, but they had finally made a breakthrough. As for me, the nightmare was far from over. I had narrowly escaped being butchered like one of my father's victims, but the scars left by that night, both physical and emotional, were deep. The image of those men wearing the faces of their victims haunted my dreams, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, even though they had been caught, there were others out there, still watching, still waiting. I started seeing a therapist a few days after the attack. Judge Mercer insisted, and deep down, I knew he was right. I couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. The weight of everything, the discovery of my father's crimes, the trial, the attack, was too much for me to bear on my own. My therapist, Dr. Larkin, was patient, kind, and understanding, but even she struggled to comprehend the horrors I had lived through. In our sessions, I recounted everything. The twisted business my father had run, the hundreds of lives lost, the night I nearly became just another victim. She listened without judgment, offering support and guidance as I worked through the trauma. It wasn't easy. Some nights, the nightmares were so vivid that I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, convinced that the attackers were still coming for me. But slowly, day by day, I began to heal. The police kept me informed as the investigation continued, and more arrests were made. The network was vast, spanning multiple countries, but with each piece of the puzzle that fell into place, I felt a small measure of justice for the lives lost. As for my father and mother, they were both serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. The horror of what they had done had shocked the nation, and their names became synonymous with evil. But even though they were behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that their legacy, the darkness they had helped create, would linger long after they were gone. I used the reward money I had received from the investigation to buy a modest house, far away from the place where it had all started. I didn't need much, just a quiet place where I could rebuild my life, away from the shadows of my past. I donated a large portion of the money to the families of my father's victims, hoping it would help them find some semblance of peace. But as much as I tried to move on, I knew I could never truly escape what had happened. The events of those years had shaped me, changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel safe again. One day, after a particularly intense therapy session, I received another package. It was smaller than the last one, neatly wrapped in brown paper with no return address. My hands shook as I opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a single human tooth, polished to a gleaming white, and a note. "We're still out here." I dropped the note, my breath catching in my throat. They weren't done with me yet. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun.